Hello, class. Welcome to our discussion of Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. First, before we begin, I wanted to show you my copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is one that's about 100 years old, maybe a little bit older than that. As you know, the book is over 150 years old, so this century-year-old edition is still fairly new compared to the original versions. The first edition came out as a serial in newspaper, so it's published weekly, and then after that it came out as a double volume set, and this one here is who knows what edition this is, but this is probably hundreds of editions and thousands and thousands and thousands of copies in, so it's not that valuable, except for just that it's interesting that it's old. I'm a bit of a bibliophile, so I like some of the actual old texts. But at any rate, let's talk a little bit about Harriet Beecher Stowe. So while Harriet Beecher Stowe was not the first person to advocate for the end of slavery, few abolitionists had the impact of Harriet Beecher Stowe. This is not to take away from the work of writers, most notably our friends Olaudah Equiano and Frederick Douglass, nor the armed struggles that took place, specifically the Haitian Revolution, Gabriel's Rebellion in Virginia, Nat Turner's Rebellion also in Virginia, plus all the small-scale slave revolts which made prospects of owning human beings that much more tenuous. I'm also leaving out Negro Fort in Apalachicola, which is a major event. If you haven't heard of it, it's worth checking into. But nonetheless, when Harriet Beecher Stowe began writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, it would have been hard to imagine how much of an impact this one event could have, not only in her initial goals, but in few ways that others would have foreseen. As with many works of literature, the creation of Uncle Tom's Cabin was influenced by several factors. First, and importantly, Harriet Beecher Stowe was a devout Christian, as you can tell when you read this text. And she had trouble seeing slave owners as acting within any Christian frame. She also read the narrative of a man named, formerly enslaved man, named Josiah Henson, as well as numerous other primary sources, to give her a feeling of what slavery was like. Another factor in her writing was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Now, if the abolitionist movement needed gas to get it moving, the Fugitive Slave Act was like rocket fuel. Prior to the act, enslaved Africans in the South could escape to a free state, and they had a strong chance of remaining free. The act, the Fugitive Slave Act, changed everything, specifically for the abolitionist movement. And once it was enacted, this required those citizens in free states, white citizens in free states, to act as deputies for slaveholders in the South. It's also important to keep in mind that shortly before she wrote her novel, Stowe lost a beloved daughter. When her young daughter died, Stowe learned for the first time what it was like to lose a child, and transferred that empathy to the plight of an enslaved mother who had just had her children sold. While there were many likely other reasons which propelled Stowe to write her novel, these ultimately pushed her abolitionism from theory into practice. When Stowe first published her book, it was an immediate bestseller. Sales skyrocketed in the North and overseas, but the book, not surprisingly, was banned throughout the South. Despite the ban, apparently enough people read or heard the content of Uncle Tom's Cabin and immediately started publishing their own anti-Tom novels. The worry was that Stowe's depictions of white Southerners was a gross mischaracterization of the slaveholding class. Much of their mythology rested on the idea of paternalism. The plantation owners were loving fathers who, on rare occasions, spanked a child for misbehavior, but was never cruel. Stowe's novel depicted the owners in a very different light. Good masters, and I'm putting that in quotes, good masters could be nice, but capitalism was such that owning human property made it possible when times were tough. Human beings, by far the greatest moneymaker in the South, could be sold if necessary to save the livelihood of the slave-owning class, as you saw happening in Uncle Tom's Cabin. An enslaved African could have a very benevolent owner, but if the slave owner was prone to gambling or drinking, all could be lost, including your children. One didn't need a cruel master, as it was somewhat likely that most enslaved Africans would eventually be sold, and whether or not one went to a cruel master or not was irrelevant, as the institution itself was cruel. And always put the individual or family in danger at all times. Despite critiquing the institution and the occasional terrible characters like the famous Simon Legree in Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Stowe's book doesn't dig deeper into the white psyche, which allowed for this to happen in the first place. The devaluation of human life, or even the very need to write a book to get white people, North and South, to have sympathy for other people that don't look like them. Southern slaveholders didn't like this portrayal of their lives because it made them feel as if they were participating in an evil institution, but they were. White Northerners, however, were hardly free of racism, as is depicted in the book. Many opposed slavery, but still had held very white supremacist views of Africans. Most, if not all, slave narratives were written for and published by white people with the express intent of abolishing slavery. Ending racism, however, was different. As far as literature goes, few, if any, books of the 19th century had as much of an impact as Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel did. If we are to trust the apocryphal story about Stowe's 1862 meeting with Abraham Lincoln, where the president was said to have joked, "So you're the little woman who started this great war," or something to that effect, then Uncle Tom's Cabin is definitely an example of an impactful book. And if you can write a novel that starts a war that helps to end slavery, then you've written a good book. Whether the people read the book or saw one of the multitude of Tom plays, is what they were called, created after the book's release, white Americans were, often for the first time, finding themselves sympathizing with the enslaved. And remember that a lot of the people that are reading this are up north. They're also competing with a growing free black working class that's growing specifically in New York. So these are Irish immigrants, largely German immigrants, etc., who are now beginning to sympathize, if not having read the book, having seen the plays or depictions of the books. For this, Stowe did something that few other writers were able to do prior, and that's to get whites to see non-whites as human beings, as crazy as that sounds today. As I mentioned, after the book was released, Stowe was immediately met with heavy criticism, as Southern white writers wrote their own versions of Uncle Tom, where Tom and his fellow Africans were treated like family in Christian households in the South. Others tried to tear apart Stowe's book on a factual basis, saying the entire book was made up of lies, fake news, in our modern parlance, fake book. To bolster her book, Stowe released another book the following year that she called A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. The key was a book of her sources. She mentioned Josiah Henson as a main source, and much to Josiah Henson's pleasure, as he referred to himself as the real Uncle Tom for years, really for the rest of his life. She also included various excerpts from other narratives and several news clippings to show the fictional events in her story were only barely fictional. Included in the news articles was one about a former resident of New York State who was kidnapped and sold into slavery, but eventually found freedom over a decade later. That man, at great personal pain, went on to write his own book, adding to the growing body of anti-slavery narratives, but also supporting Harriet Beecher Stowe's claim. His name was Solomon Northup, and the book he wrote was 12 Years a Slave. Now, while Henson's narrative could be seen as the inspiration for Uncle Tom's Cabin, Northup's 12 Years a Slave was a validation. From the first page, where Northup dedicated the book to Harriet Beecher Stowe and calls his narrative another key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, to his continual reference to Uncle Tom's Cabin throughout the text, which you'll read. Anyone who knows Stowe's book and reads Northup will see that they are very closely connected. One aspect I like to point out is with one of the main characters in Stowe's book, Eliza, one of the most famous characters in American literature, especially of that time frame. In fact, I might have a picture of her sitting in this book right now. This is a scene right here. Eliza crossing over the ice is one of the most famous scenes in American literature. Interestingly, Northup had a character in his book who was also named Eliza. And keep in mind that Solomon Northup could have chosen any names he wanted to, because these people aren't ones that we could easily go back and find. And he only left their first names anyway. So to have a woman with the same name is interesting, to say the least. Stowe's Eliza in Uncle Tom's Cabin escapes with her child and finds happiness outside of slavery, and eventually is able to resettle in Africa, something only a few thousand African Americans were able to do. But many anti-slavery societies and abolitionists desired is they wanted to end slavery, but not necessarily, they weren't looking for social integration. So I just want to point that out. Northup's Eliza is unfortunately a more realistic depiction. She is initially living a life of a kept woman, has children with the good master, but when he dies, she is, as you can probably guess, sold along with her children. She witnesses her son and her daughter sold in front of her, including her very young daughter, who is to be sold likely into brothels in New Orleans. The pain is too much for Northup's Eliza, and she never recovers from the trauma and dies, knowing that she cannot protect her children. If you've ever seen the film, this is one of the most heart-wrenching scenes in the film, in a film that's covered with heart-wrenching scenes. Northup even claims that death would be better for her children, knowing what life would likely be to endure under slavery's evil yoke. And to be honest, we don't know if Northup's characters are fictionalized names or not. And it's certainly possible that Northup uses Eliza's name to show what likely would have happened to a real Eliza. But at any rate, whereas Stowe's Eliza is one of fictional hope, Northup's Eliza is the exact opposite. Yet it is through Stowe's novel that we're allowed to see Northup. This is not to take away from Northup's work. To me, Northup's work is better written, especially for a modern audience. His writing's powerful, rarely dry, to the point. Nonetheless, one of the many different things that makes Stowe's work problematic is her blatant racism within the text. While this can be excused to some extent by the time that she wrote, as well as her experiences as a white woman, the truth is that there's no way a white woman living in the 19th century could truly understand what an enslaved African in the South would have endured, as much as she tried. While Stowe's book is melodramatic and reads as very heavy-handed propaganda, and if you think this is too harsh a term, just flip through your copy of the book and look for any of those Dear Reader sections where she's pleading to the readers to please remember their Christianity. Not to mention the perpetuation of stereotypes that Stowe used in the book, which allows for the unfortunate Uncle Tom figure to come about in our modern vocabulary, our usage of the term Uncle Tom, which is one of the book's most lasting legacies, and will likely make the book eternally cringeworthy to teach in class, for me at least. Much more people know the term Uncle Tom than have read the book. Critic David McReynolds wrote a really great book on Uncle Tom's Cabin and the history of it. Discusses modern depiction in the book, Mightier Than the Sword, as being very inaccurate depictions of the character and a severe misreading of the novel. This is somewhat true. Stowe's Uncle Tom was hardly a weak figure by any means. He sacrificed tremendously to help other people on the farm, and unfortunately suffered because of this. And he points out to a great many powerful figures in African American history who admired the character of Uncle Tom. Frederick Douglass is one of the main ones, who had critiques of Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel and Harriet Beecher Stowe herself, but was also enamored with the character of Uncle Tom and chose to act as Uncle Tom during an American exhibition towards the end of his life at the World's Fair. Langston Hughes was also an admirer of Harriet Beecher Stowe and the figure of Uncle Tom. Paul Robeson, in fact, a very famous actor from the Harlem Renaissance, was even set to perform Uncle Tom in a never-released film version of the book. Nonetheless, that's toothpaste that won't go back into the tube very easily. And if that's a misreading of Uncle Tom, it's one that's likely to last. The terminology that we use today when somebody is called an Uncle Tom. Besides the legacy of the characterization of Uncle Tom, the book's history also had several interesting spin-offs. 12 Years a Slave, besides 12 Years a Slave, another on the other side, part of the anti-Uncle Tom novels, was written by a Southern author named Thomas Dixon. After seeing one of the so-called Tom plays, he was so incensed at the way that white Southern people were depicted in the novel that he immediately set to write his own correction to Stowe's novel. His reaction to Uncle Tom's Cabin was a series of books, most notably one named The Klansman, which glorified the Ku Klux Klan. Dixon's book was eventually adapted into a film by the director D.W. Griffith and became the first feature-length film, The Incredibly Racist Birth of a Nation, 1915, not to be confused with the recent one that was done about Nat Turner's Rebellion. But with the 1915 version of by D.W. Griffith, Birth of a Nation, this film almost single-handedly revived the almost extinct Ku Klux Klan and began a century of violence that we're still in the midst of today. And we can, of course, think of Charlottesville as one example. On the other hand, D.W. Griffith's film created its own backlash. That somewhat new NAACP, the organization, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was so infuriated that this film was garnering the attention that it received, even in the White House with President Woodrow Wilson, that the civil rights organization began protesting theaters that were showing Birth of a Nation and gained incredible exposure, catapulting the civil rights organization into the one that we know today. Furthermore, a young African-American director named Oscar Micheaux created his own answer to Griffith's film, Within Our Gates, which is now seen as the first feature-length African-American film. Still, other Hollywood directors tried multiple times to use the new medium, film, to retell the story of Uncle Tom's Cabin. A 1927 version, by far the best of the silent versions, was another response to D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. These are just three responses to Birth of a Nation, which was a response to Uncle Tom's Cabin. Yet the last film, the 1927 one, angered a white Southern writer that so much that she went home from the theater and shortly afterwards penned her own correction. Her name was Margaret Mitchell, and her book, which later became a movie, was called Gone with the Wind, which is often seen as the home for the Lost Cause mythology, which upheld the idea of Confederate sympathizers and still remains one of those novels today, novels and films. While the Lost Cause still has some staying power, as we see with the Confederate statue debates that are going on today, Uncle Tom's Cabin's unintended anti-racist legacy also has its own continued legacy. And we can think of Solomon Northup in this instance. 12 Years a Slave, the book at first, was lost for a number of years and then later became a film, as you probably know, and introduced a new conversation about America's history with race and slavery at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement. And that speaks volumes to the reach of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which probably a lot of people who saw the film didn't even know the connections between the two texts. So is this book problematic? Yes, absolutely. But did it have an impact on the way we see slavery and race? To that, there is no doubt. Even Malcolm X said that Uncle Tom's Cabin, the novel, allowed him to understand slavery in a way that he didn't understand prior. So that's a pretty strong recommendation for the novel. And if the story about Lincoln and Stowe, Abraham Lincoln and Harriet Beecher Stowe, is really true, that she was indeed the little woman who started the Great War, the Civil War, and this being a war that eventually brought about the Emancipation Proclamation, which led to the enlistment of black soldiers into the U.S. Army and helped end the war and ultimately end slavery, then I do think it's safe to offer some praise up to Harriet Beecher Stowe, like Frederick Douglass did and Solomon Northup did. She's certainly worthy of criticism, and to that there is no doubt. But considering we're currently still living in a world, for better or worse, shaped by her book, there is also no doubt. Therefore, it's in our best interest to know her book, and after we read it, I want you to read Solomon Northup's book, and then Harriet Jacobs' book if you get the chance, and all these other narratives, because it's all part of a larger discussion that's taking place. But I wanted to give you just some background on the text as we're looking at this, and as we're going through Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, I wanted to just help you understand this in the larger context. So the video that you got right here is a little bit longer than I like to give normally, but at the same time, I think it's important, and that's one of the reasons I want to feature this text in the class. I thought it'd be a great disservice if we didn't have this cultural capital under our belt. So it's a long book, a long film, but nonetheless, it's worth reading. All right, thank you. And if you have any questions, of course, let me know.